Welcome to another episode of the Film Florida podcast. My name is John Lux, and I'm the Executive Director of Film Florida. We're talking with another very talented person today. Before I introduce you to our guest, thanks for downloading this episode of the podcast. Please make sure you subscribe, rate, and review the Film Florida podcast. The more subscriptions, ratings, and reviews we get, the more likely others will find us. Also, don't forget we have a Film Florida merchandise page. Visit teespring.com/stores/Film Florida to purchase Film Florida t-shirts, sweatshirts, and coffee mugs. Dan Myrick was born in Sarasota and graduated from UCF. He's an award-winning writer, producer, and director, best known for being part of the core team and co-director of the Blair Witch Project. Since the Blair Witch Project, Dan has been involved in a steady stream of independent films, but his latest initiative is to bring more film production to the Tampa area. We talked to Dan about that and other things. Here's my interview with Dan Myrick. Thanks for spending some time with us today, Dan.
Great to be here.
So I believe you were born in Sarasota and graduated from UCF, right?
That's correct.
Talk about growing up in Florida and then going to UCF.
Well, I was born in Lombo Key and spent most of my childhood there, and then lived up and down the southwest coast for a few decades. Fort Myers, Sarasota, St. Pete, Tampa area. And then around 1989, I suppose it was, I submitted to the University of Central Florida Film School. They were having an inaugural kind of film program. Got accepted there, and so I started there in 90 and did about 2.5 years or so there and graduated, I think it was in 93, from the film program at UCF.
So you obviously knew you wanted to go into the industry. What drove you in that direction?
It's interesting because, I've always been sort of a visual guy. My mom was a painter, and, she encouraged me to do artwork and drawing when I was young. So I tended to tell stories on paper at an early age. And then, in my preteens, I got a DSLR camera. I shouldn't say DSLR, an SLR camera, and started taking pictures and learned how to sort of tell stories with images. And then my aunt, Pat, back in the day, bought me this book on the behind the scenes of making movies. And it was called Movie Magic. And I was fascinated by, how they made Godzilla and, all these kind of Hollywood classics. And that was my first indication that there is a whole industry here on making movies. And one thing led to another, and I went and saw Close Encounters of the Third Kind, and I think that's really where it all sort of came together for me and said, hey, I want to do this. I want to make people feel the way I feel in this movie theater. And then from that point on, just sort of started applying myself to telling stories on camera.
So you graduated from UCF in 1994, and a few years later, you and 4 others got together for the Blair Witch Project. Looking back, what were the early conversations like, and how did that film come about?
Well, the original idea, or at least the original kernel of the idea, Ed Sanchez, my co-directing partner on the project, and myself, thought of this cool scene in the woods about this creepy old house, and you're sort of locked into this camera POV where you're going into this house and you can't turn away. So sort of this documentary format of going into this creepy house in the woods and what you find in it. And that was sort of got the idea going back in film school. And as time moved on, we developed it more and more and came up with the notion that there's a reason for this film crew to be in the woods. And it's sort of shot like a documentary, inspired by shows like In Search Of and Ancient Astronauts, which were sort of pseudo-documentaries of their day. And it wasn't until after we all graduated that Greg Hale, the producer, and I were co-writing a script together. And I sort of an offhand way pitched him this idea that Ed and I had come up with, and he just fell in love with it. And a few days later, he said, if you want to develop this woods movie you're talking about, I've got some money saved up, and, maybe we can get things going on it. And that sort of got the ball rolling. So in the early days, it was Ed, Greg, and myself starting the pre-production, if you will, of the investor reel that we shot that got the Blair Witch going.
So you finish the film, you get a distribution deal, and the film comes out, and it absolutely takes off. What were your expectations for the film, and did you ever imagine that it would take off like it did?
Well, our early expectations, like many independent filmmakers that are total unknowns, is just to get into a good festival. And when we were accepted to Sundance, that was sort of the holy grail for us. We
Sure.
felt like we hit a milestone. And so everything beyond that was sort of gravy. And, we had hoped at the time that we could just sell the movie and repay our investors. Maybe it would be a calling card project and set us up for maybe a TV deal or something like that. Because, at the time we were looking at it as a cool little movie, and it was pretty scary and kind of a local scene, but it was still a very small film. It had no name actors in it. It was a very modest production budget, and it was designed to look like a home video, so that's not the kind of thing that you see in wide release. So our expectations were pretty contained, and thinking that if we could get a sale at Sundance and a TV deal or something like that, that would be a pretty big coup for us. But what ultimately happened, none of us were prepared for, and the reaction at Sundance was just overwhelming. And, after a certain point, you're just sort of along for the ride. As things continue to expand, we were getting calls from artists that bought the movie that, big studios were rearranging their release schedules based on when ours was going to come out. And we just were, taken aback by the idea of that. And so it went crazy, and part of me was enjoying the ride, and part of me was fascinated by being elevated so quickly into this new realm. And there's another more kind of analytical side of my brain that was sort of stepping back from all of this and looking at it as sort of a case study of how something so out of left field and such counter programming to current Hollywood fare during those days can be such a big hit. And to this day, it's just a reaffirmation that it's possible. It gets done every now and then, that something that people really respond to at a certain timing being right, can really take off.
And what do you attribute what happened? Was it the story? Was it the type of filmmaking that it was? I mean, were you ever able to put your finger on what caused it to take off the way it did?
I mean, it's almost always a combination of things. I mean, you mentioned a couple of them. Certainly, the style we shot it in was sort of an emerging aesthetic. We were experiencing at the time like the first season of Real World from MTV, and 24/7 News was out, and the public was becoming sensitized to sort of that shaky, reality camera aesthetic. So it was a combination of that. The internet was sort of just coming into its own. Social media hadn't come out yet, so people were taking a lot of what was on the web as truth. So there was that, and then good old-fashioned rags to riches story, which is what a lot of press likes to write about. We were a bunch of nobody filmmakers that were making good, and then I like to think as a filmmaker, at the end of the day, the movie ultimately paid off. It was a genuinely scary experience for a lot of people that were getting frustrated with big Hollywood budget movies that weren't doing their job. And so I think you put all that together, and the planets aligned for us to be a big commercial success.
And since the Blair Witch Project, you've had a steady string of solid projects. A few years after the Blair Witch hysteria calmed down, you wrote and directed Solstice, which was another edge-of-your-seat film. Talk about what you brought from your previous experiences to that film.
I think the biggest thing for me coming away from Blair Witch is that it taught me a lot as a director. So much about effective execution when you're shooting a movie is casting well. And I give so much credit to our actors on Blair Witch, and we spent almost a year, over the course of a year, auditioning hundreds of people for those roles. And so that's a big important thing for me, is not only in the casting process, but also on set, allowing the actors the freedom to do what you hired them to do, not getting in their way. So that relationship with actors I really cherish, and was able to bring that to bear on Solstice. And I think I got, a really great ensemble cast on that film. It was a lot of fun to shoot. It was a it was a tough shoot because it was right post Katrina, so the crew was scattered everywhere, and there was still, everything was still kind of soggy post Katrina, but we really wanted to bring work back into the area, and so everyone sort of knuckled down and got the movie done. But it was a good experience, and I was very fortunate to work some very talented actors on that one.
And then after that, you produced 6 films for Warner Brothers. Do any of those films stick out to you, and why?
Well, yeah, I mean, that was a cool time. I was teamed up with Tony Krantz and John Scheiben of 24 and X-Files, respectively, and we had a great situation with the Warner Brothers when they were still sort of pushing hard on their DVD side, and we were able to do 6 movies for them. And our first 3, I directed one of them, wrote and directed one of them called Believers, which was that was a lot of fun, and outlined and helped create another project called Rest Stop, which we did a sequel to, and that was a standout because it was at the time the highest grossing non-theatrical release in Warner Brothers history, and so we really came out swinging on those first 3 films, and did a follow-up to that on the second 3. So it was a awesome experience, and the films to this day are still generating revenue and still doing well. And Rest Stop was definitely a standout, and Believers I liked a lot. It got a lot of critical acclaim, which as an artist is very satisfying.
And Dan, a few of you from that original Blair Witch core team have done some projects together since then. Talk about the relationships that you built way back then and how they continue to work.
Well, definitely, Ed and I have co-written another sequel script to Blair Witch, which we hope one day will get made. We certainly have ideas about carrying on the universe and mythology in the Blair Witch world, if Lionsgate, the current owner of the rights, feels inclined to bring us back in. So that would be very cool. One of my composers, Kay Zalachakti, who I've worked with since film school, actually, I've incorporated on several of my films. My most recent, I shouldn't say the one before my most recent, I just finished this film called Skyman, but the one prior to that was called Under the Bed, which he did the score for, music composer, successful music composer in his own right. So yeah, and I've got this new current project called Black Veil that we're doing in Florida that I'm, reaching out to some of my old film school buddies that are still in Florida, that I'm happy to bring them back into the fold and work with them, just like we did back in the day. On this new anthology we're doing. So yeah, they're relationships you make early on. And it's back in the day when nobody was famous and no one knew anything about anything. And you
Right.
kind of form those bonds when you're all just kind of clueless. And now everyone goes out and does their own thing. And now, 20 years later, we're all experienced professionals now. That's what we call ourselves. So it's fun to reconnect and reminisce as you're on set. But they're people that I trust, and that's a big part of staying, I think, centered and ultimately satisfied and happy in this business, is just working with people you trust.
Well, as you were saying that, I actually was waiting for you to pause so I can say it seems like there's a trust level there.
Yeah, and I certainly, it's the kind of business that can be driven by, a lot of unsavory types, which unfortunately I have run into from time to time. But my mandate, and I tell everybody this, try to get to a point where, you can be choosy about who you work with and work with the people that you trust. And ultimately, you're going to be happier at the end of the process, because it's a very trying, tough business. Just from an artistic standpoint, you're dealing with an art form that is inherently collaborative and inherently tough to get financed, inherently tough to get seen, and that can have its own kind of set of stressors and agony. So it's just like going to war and making a movie. So if you're going to do it, if you're going to commit to something that draws so much of your energy and psychology and whatnot, you better be aligned with people that you trust, because you're going to need to rely on them throughout the whole process.
So that segues actually into the next question. And of course, now you can't use trust as the important thing, but when people ask you for advice that want to get into the business, other than telling them to work with people they trust, what do you tell them?
Well, I mean, you have to believe in what it is you're doing. I mean, I'm a firm believer that you do your best work when it's something you're passionate about, and if you've got a good idea and a good concept that you're passionate about, then, the first order of business is trying to get people to notice what it is you want to get made. And whether you're a writer or a director or an actor or what have you, there's a lot of competition out there that you have to try to rise above. The good news is that it's never been easier to get something on film, to get something, a reel built for yourself. If you have a small script, to get it produced by, an energetic filmmaker, and the equipment is there, the production value is easier to obtain than ever before, and then you can distribute it online with YouTube or Vimeo or half a dozen other platforms out there to be seen and be basically your own marketer, your own distribution platform. So that's what I'm telling young filmmakers today, is be prepared to wear several different hats starting out and learn how to market yourself and brand yourself in this new arena. Because if you sit around waiting for the phone to ring, that a studio is going to produce your script or something like that, even if you're lucky enough to get one read, you're going to be waiting around a long time.
Now, spinning things forward for you, you're involved in a great initiative in the Tampa area in Ybor City. The Power Station is a creative hub and cooperative workspace for industry professionals. So talk about that venture. Where did it start and where is it in the current form?
It was basically an idea rooted in the notion that a handful of industry professionals, my partners Christian Krempel and Doug Fox that are there in Tampa, we decided that we wanted to have a space residing in an area of Tampa that we all love very much, in the Ybor City, and kind of get back to basics. We did our time in LA and we sort of know how the sausage is made there and what's done right and sort of what's done wrong, and bring that experience to bear back in Florida, where we're all from, and, sort of like reestablish a film community there that is doing really high quality work for all the right reasons, and also be commercially viable. Our thought was, it starts at the ground up. You have to encourage and cultivate creative talent, indigenous creative talent, and Florida is pretty unique when it comes to film schools and technical schools. You've got everything from, UCF, my alma mater, to Full Sail for the Performing Arts. Tampa's got film schools, University of Florida, Ringling, of course, which I grew up near. There's some great educational institutions in Florida that are pumping out high quality filmmakers and crew that are all leading, and they're all going to Atlanta or New Orleans or to LA or what have you. We're like, let's try to keep those folks in Florida and cultivate this creative community to build our own sort of brand of filmmaking. And with it becoming more decentralized in LA now, where you can set up production facilities, and much is being shot on green screen now, so you're not as location dependent as you used to be. You can distribute your content online now, so you don't have to, necessarily abide by the old distribution mechanisms. It's never been a better time to establish a creative production hub in an area like Tampa that is, I think, uniquely suited to be, on the cutting edge, on the next kind of frontier of this new filmmaking paradigm. And that's what we hope to do. We're very, very optimistic. We're going to start off, small and modest, but like anything else, you've got to build up. And over the years, we hope to be a force to be reckoned with in Florida.
And talk about the moral support, for lack of a better term, that you have gotten thus far from Hillsborough County.
Well, that's been huge for me. I mean, there's, a lot I love about LA, and I tell a lot of filmmakers, if you're really serious about the business, it's good to spend some time out there and see how things are done at the A level. Understand what you're up against. But the downside is, quite frankly, is that it's an unforgiving place, and there's a lot of people competing for the same scraps of acknowledgement, if you will. And people are pretty jaded out there, and it's not an inexpensive place to shoot a movie. Even if you're trying to do something low budget, you're paying top dollar for location fees, top dollar for crew, top dollar for actors, top dollar for everything, because the competition is so fierce. Where in a place like Florida, people are, reaching out with open arms to get us involved, whether it's a restaurant owner or the local film commissions. These people are excited to have us there. They're encouraging, and they're on your team. And that's a good feeling. I have to say that it's nice to be welcomed and encouraged and appreciated for what we're trying to do. And that's kind of, bring storytelling and filmmaking into the area. And that makes it fun again. And that's, I think, what is really nice about Florida and Hillsborough and this area is that they've really been enthusiastic about what we're doing and have been very helpful in that regard. In both, St. Pete and Tampa, with, Tyler Materlich and Tony Armour and Ken Hagan, those guys on the local government level have been very, very helpful and encouraging for us to do what we're doing. And that means a lot. It's not the kind of encouragement you get in LA anymore. Unless you're, of course, a big $100 million project. We're not there yet, but it's nice to have that cooperation.
And not to, hold your feet to the fire, but what's the 5-year plan? Where do you want the power station to be 5 years from now?
Well, my hope and my desire and our goal is to really develop indigenous development projects from the ground up in Florida. I mean, one of the I've felt trouble spots and sort of blind spots, I should say, in Orlando when I was in Central Florida back in the early 90s is that there was this sort of LA-centric notion that we had to put all of our energies in wooing LA to come and shoot stuff in Florida. And there is certainly a component to that. And you want those big projects with, high-profile actors to come and utilize Florida as a production resource. But that's usually motivated by state incentives. You're just not going to convince a $30 million production or $40 million production to spend the same amount in Florida as you would in LA. It just doesn't make sense. So you really have to have a state incentive to really motivate that. So the other part of that equation is encouraging local development and local film production from the people that already live here. And that's sort of our goal. That's sort of our entry point into growing a business from the ground up, from local production, local filmmakers that have done their time here, and curating the right kinds of projects and the right kind of talent to where we don't have to call ourselves Hollywood East. We can be Tampa, Florida. and Atlanta is doing it. There's no reason why Tampa can't do it as well, and St. Pete as well, and be our own brand, our own thing. And in 5 years, there's, to me, a viable production model there from the power station that we are making films that are high quality. Part of that may go through traditional distribution platforms. We're also setting up an online distribution platform with our partners at ihorror.com to where we can distribute directly online and start getting into that new space. So all that can be done in-house, at home, and then within a few years, we are not going to be looking for those projects from LA to come to Tampa. We will be those projects in Tampa. So that all comes down to just making good product, and that's what I think we're good at doing. So we're going to focus on that.
Well, it's very exciting. And as someone who on a daily basis tries to get more projects, more work, more jobs here in the state of Florida, it's obviously something that we support wholeheartedly and are looking forward to seeing the progress.
Great. Well, thanks for having me on, and hopefully we'll be having a lot more discussions in the future about it. But we're very encouraged about what we're seeing. We're encouraged about the future in Florida, and there's no reason why we can't have our piece of the pie too. It's an exciting time, I think, despite a lot of the sort of the cloudy predictions in the traditional model in filmmaking and all that. I've always been a hopeless optimist, and I think Florida and Tampa, St. Pete in particular, are uniquely positioned to sort of usher in a new era, and they can be the new Atlanta, in my opinion. So that's what we're hoping to help out with.
And Dan, if people want to learn more about you or the Power Station, where do they go?
They can go to our website, which is www.thepower-station.com. And, you'll get updates there. And we'll also have our new series, the Black Veil series, which just launched its landing page at www.blackveilonline.com. And you can audition for a role for the show. You can keep track on updates. And as we scale up with these productions, we'll certainly scale up online to keep people more engaged. So either one of those two URLs will allow you to sign up and get information.
Well, Dan, thanks so much for being on the podcast today. I appreciate you taking the time to talk with us, and I look forward to watching the progress of the Power Station and everything you're doing.
Thanks, John. Glad to be here, and hope to talk to you soon.
Thanks so much, Dan. Thanks for listening to this episode of the Film Florida podcast. For more information about Film Florida, go to filmflorida.org or visit our social media pages on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and LinkedIn. Check out the Film Florida merchandise at teespring.com/stores/Film Florida, and please remember to subscribe, rate, and review the podcast.